But I do want to spend some time tonight, briefly, of course, before we get out, to talk about Islam. I offered a number of topics, and Carl picked this one. And it certainly is one that is of great concern to all of us. And I want to give you a number of different aspects that I think you will find helpful. Number one, we're going to ask, what is Islam? What are some of the basic beliefs? Number two, how can we witness to our Muslim friends? Because that is, I think, going to be very significant as we talk about really one of the fastest growing religions in the world, second largest religion in the world. And then I'll have a few comments to say as well about Islam and terrorism and how we can begin to think about that as well. So a lot of different issues we're going to be addressing tonight, but I thought we would begin by first talking about how we can see this in terms of what has been happening in our culture. There was a book written a number of years ago in the early 1990s, and before that actually had been written as an article that appeared in Foreign Affairs by Samuel Huntington, who was a professor at Harvard University. I've shared a podium with him, and he's no longer alive. But at that time, when we were seeing the end of the Soviet Union, the dropping of the Iron Curtain, there were a lot of people that were predicting that this 21st century would be the end of history. That there would no longer be a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so this would really be a time in which we'd have unprecedented peace, and things would be very different. And instead, he argued that he believed that there would be a clash of three major civilizations. That first is what we would call Western universalism. And by that we mean the West, by all that we talk about in terms of the Western world. That is, one person, one vote, the idea of rights and principles and political procedures and redress of grievances and things of that nature. The second thing he said was a very significant civilization would be Chinese assertion. Don't want to forget, more than 1 billion Chinese. But the third, and the one I really want to focus on this evening, is what he called Muslim militancy. At a time when many people thought that all the conflicts in the world would end because we would no longer have these two superpowers at each other, he was predicting instead that there would be a major conflict between the West and Islam. Now, when he says Muslim militancy, he wasn't necessarily suggesting, for example, that all Muslims are militant or all Muslim countries are militant, but he did believe that there would be a political clash between those two. Was he right? If you go back and read that book, I mean, he made prediction after prediction, which in a sense made him almost look like an Old Testament prophet. So politically, it's been a battle between the West and Islam, but also we're going to talk for just a few minutes also about it has been a clash between Christianity and Islam, especially in terms of missions. And so we're going to look at all of those in a number of different ways. But the first thing we really want to answer the question is, what is Islam? All the way through, I'm going to try to set aside a lot of misconceptions that many people have, some which have been perpetuated by people in the media, sometimes even by presidents and well-meaning people. And one of those is oftentimes people say Islam means peace. No, Islam really means submission. It's the idea of submitting my will to the will of Allah. And so when we talk about this, I want to spend just a little bit of time kind of looking at the origin and history of Islam. And as I go through this, if some of you find yourself saying, I'd like to study this in a little more depth, we have some books out there that are available. And also at the end, I will share with you that you could get a PowerPoint presentation of a presentation very similar to this, so that you could look over it again. You could use it in your own presentation. So if this goes a little bit fast, I'll be doing my best to try to cover all of this and get us out on time, but also I'll be talking a little bit faster. As some of you already noticed, I tend to talk at about 120 words a minute with gusts over 200. So, we're going to move through this a little bit faster because for some of you it is review, but I hope also for some of you it will also be an education about these issues. And even if you studied this before, I hope to drop in some ideas that maybe even if you've studied Islam, you will find some new information that will be helpful to you. The history is pretty simple because it really goes back to Muhammad, who was born into a very powerful Arab tribe in Mecca in AD 570 AD. He was raised after losing his parents basically by a grandfather and later by an uncle. And then at the age of 25, something very significant happened. because up until that time he had traveled in caravans and found himself really just living kind of on the edge of poverty, but now he married a woman who was 15 years his senior, 40 years of age, he was 25, and so no longer did he have to go and travel in those caravans. Then we see that at the age of 40, he began to say that he had visions. Now, some of those are described in his biography that is written about him, and it seems like in some cases he may have been going through some kind of seizure. As a matter of fact, at first he really didn't know what to believe about this, but his wife convinced him that instead he was receiving revelations, and he later recited that those were actually from the angel Gabriel. And so he began to have these recitations. Gabriel told him to recite, and the word recitation is where we get this word idea of the Qur'an. And so as we go on from there, we can see that a number of other things took place. First of all, those recitations began to be collected first in a verbal form, but some were written down in bones and stones, later collected in what today we call the Qur'an. But he began in the midst of this polytheistic culture in Mecca to preach a very different message, and that is to say that there was only one God, the God Allah. Now, as he began to do that, there were a number of things that happened because he was rejected for his preaching. There were many that even threatened his life. So he eventually escaped from Mecca to an oasis in the north known as Medina and began to live there with many of his followers. But now something dramatically took place. Whereas in Mecca he had been a prophet, now in Medina he actually was able to command an army. And so a number of things began to happen simultaneously. First of all, that flight is known as the Hijra. But as he is now up there, he is fighting a number of different battles. And so he's now not just a prophet, but he is a military commander. He wins one very significant battle, the Battle of Badr, and loses some others. But eventually now he becomes the dominant military force in this region. And now, interestingly enough, he takes 10,000 men back to Mecca and takes it over. Now, in some respects, it wasn't much of a battle because he'd worked out with some of the city fathers that he was going to be there, but nevertheless, he has now come in, he has removed all of these idols that were in the Kaaba, we'll talk more about that in just a minute, and sets up this strict monotheism known as Islam. Interestingly enough, he's now at the very height of his power, and something very unexpected takes place. He dies in AD 632. But rather than that being the end of Islam, it is now one of the most remarkable expansions of religion in the history of the world. Because first the Muslim army begins to leave the Arabian Peninsula to the east, and they go into Persia, and they take over that land. That would be present-day Syria and Iran and Iraq. And then the Muslim army begins to travel and take over all the land of northern Africa, goes into Spain, which becomes Moorish Spain. And if it were not for the defeat of the Muslim army at the hands of Charles Martel, quite possible that Islam would have taken over most of the European area at that particular time. When you think about Islam today, one of the things that's probably best to look at is to look at the distribution that you can see, because here you have the distribution of Islam in the green, and you can see that it is no longer just a Middle East religion. As a matter of fact, the one country that has the most number of Muslims is actually Indonesia. So it is certainly the dominant religion in most of northern Africa and goes all the way into Asia. You can also see, and we'll talk about the distinction in just a minute, the dark green are the Shia Muslims, the light green are the Sunni Muslims, but you can see the distribution. And for those of you that are ever interested in missions, ever heard of the 1040 window? We've superimposed the 1040 window there, and you can see that this is a very strategic target, and you can see that Islam today is very dominant in those countries, and it's changed something rather dramatically. When I was growing up, we used to talk about in the church the closed countries, and most of those countries were what? They were communist countries. Today, some of those countries are still very closed, North Korea and Albania, and certainly aspects of China and all the rest. But really, some of those formerly communist countries are quite open. I have been, for example, to Budapest, Hungary 3 times. Some of our other staff have been there, and we actually, working with Word of Life, teach biblical principles in a castle that used to be used by the communists to indoctrinate students in communism. It was used by the communists to indoctrinate them in Marxism. Today it's used to teach Christian kids theology, which I think shows God has a sense of humor. But nevertheless, that's another story. But today, the closed countries most of the time are the Muslim countries, and I think is one of the great challenges that we face in the 21st century. Well, let's spend a little bit of time trying to understand what Islam is. And any Muslim you run into, whether it is Muslim students that I work with on college campuses and interact with, or whether you go overseas and talk with Muslims there, you will see that almost every Muslim will hold to what are called the 5 pillars of Islam. The first pillar is the Shahada. That is the repetition of the creed. There is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet. How do you become a Muslim? You say that in front of other witnesses. It is said to you when you're born. It is said to you as you die. And you say it many times a day during the time of prayer. And so, first of all, it is the Shahada. The second is the prayers, the Salat. How many times a day do Muslims pray? 5 times a day. In which direction do they face when they pray? Towards Mecca. And so if you've ever traveled in the Middle East, sometimes you will go into a hotel and you'll see a arrow on the desk, and you go, what's that for? Oh, that's the direction towards Mecca. Sometimes on an airplane, they'll have an arrow if they're going to be praying there, and so certainly prayers are very significant. The third is the zakat, or almsgiving. We'll come back to that in just a minute, but a small percentage of their wealth is to be given for the advancement of the gospel. I'll talk more about that in a minute as we talk about how some of that is used for the advancement instead of terrorism. But the fourth issue is what is known as the fast of Ramadan. During the 9th lunar month, they fast from sunrise to sunset in a number of different ways. But they can eat and do other things after that particular period of time, and it is to honor the time of the giving of the revelation by Gabriel to Muhammad. And the fifth and final pillar is what is known as the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. And every able-bodied Muslim is to go to Mecca, and as they go there, first of all, we went too fast there, so we can back that one up just real quickly. We have the idea of the Kaaba, which in that particular area is a black stone. And in there, the stone is reputed to have come from the sky, so most people believe that it was a meteorite. That actually existed before the time of Muhammad, and he simply took that particular structure and focused it as an area of various kinds of worship that takes place, as well as the things that happen in Mecca itself. So again, we oftentimes refer to the 5 pillars of Islam, but there are some that have said there aren't 5 pillars of Islam, but actually there is a 6th pillar of Islam. And what is that? Jihad. Now, jihad really is best translated in our English translations of the Qur'an as to strive or to struggle. And the concept here sometimes is used by some Muslims to be talking about the idea of striving or struggle to conform your will to the will of Allah. But I would have to say that the more common interpretation actually is one that involves some kind of military action. One of the leading scholars on Islam in this country would be Dr. Bernard Lewis, professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and he has said that the more common interpretation, and that of the overwhelming majority of the classical jurists and commentators, present jihad as an armed struggle for Islam against infidels and apostates. Now, some people will say, well, you know, some Muslims are violent, some Muslims seem relatively peaceful. What's the difference? Well, I would suggest to you that one very significant watershed would be, do they see jihad as an internal struggle? Or even if they see jihad as a military action, do they contextualize it and say that that was for Muhammad's day? If they do, they make pretty good neighbors. And most of the students that I run into on college campuses that are Muslim probably have adopted that idea, because in some respects they've made their peace with the modern world and want to come to enjoy what we provide here in American education. If, however, they see that jihad is an armed struggle against infidels and apostates, they don't make such good neighbors, do they? They're the kind of people, for example, that we might want to let know about, for example, to Homeland Security or to the Defense Department. Let's go into this issue of interpretation for just a minute, because I think it's absolutely key when we talk about this to recognize that there are various sources of revelation, quote, to Muslims. The first would be fairly obvious, and that would be what would be known as the Qur'an. It has 114 chapters known as surahs, and 86 of those were written in Mecca, known as Meccan surahs, 28 in Medina, known as Medinan surahs. But if you were to sit down and to read a Qur'an, I don't know how many of you have done that. By the way, I'm not encouraging you to do that for morning quiet time tomorrow. But if you were to even sit down and read a Qur'an, at the end, I think you would say, it's kind of unusual. A little hard to follow. Some stories that sound like things out of the Bible. But I don't get it. Almost everything that I've come to associate with Islam is really not in the Qur'an. There are a lot of sayings and things, but everything that I've come to associate with their practice is not there. And that's true, because while some of that is in the Quran, most of it is found in what is called the Hadith. Now, the Hadith are the traditional sayings of Muhammad. And in the interest of time, I won't go into them in any detail other than to simply say this. You will probably have at some time or another either worn or seen somebody worn a WWJD. What does that stand for? What would Jesus do, right? Well, theirs would be WWMD. What would Muhammad do? But they take it in a much more literal way. If I say I want to be more like Jesus, it doesn't mean I'm going to grow a beard, wear sandals and a robe, and eat fish in the Sea of Galilee. But for a Muslim, it does mean that. It means that in a sense, what was the normative culture in the 7th and 8th century of the Arab world is the normative culture for today. Ask any Muslim, for example, why do you put your pants on while you sit down? Because it's recorded in the Hadith that he put on his pants when he sat down. Why do you wrap your turban while you stand? Because it is recorded in the Hadith that Muhammad wrapped his turban while he stood. The real issue is it takes that culture and it, in a sense, makes it universal and normative for today. This is why many Muslims that call themselves fundamentalists or that we identify as fundamentalists oftentimes have trouble with the modern world. And you can also understand human rights issues. Because, let's look at this. What was the status of men in the 7th and 8th century in the Arab culture? That is the status of men today in a Muslim world. Women, you know where I'm going with this. What was the status of women in the 7th and 8th century of the Arab world? It's the status of women today, where Sharia law is implemented. But even in other countries, like Saudi Arabia, if you're a woman, you cannot vote. You cannot drive a car. You cannot leave your home without being accompanied by a male relative. Those are changing somewhat, but I think it illustrates again how important this idea of the Hadith and the traditions and the sayings are all part of the Muslim world that we find today. Let's, if we can, also talk about the fact that there are different kinds of Muslims. The first, and probably the ones we know the most about, would be what we call the Sunni Muslims. Almost 80% of all Muslims in the world fit into that category. They follow what is known as the Sunnah, which is the example or the practice of Muhammad. The Sunni Muslims, for example, would be in Egypt. We've been hearing a great deal about the Muslim Brotherhood, and they would be a little different brand of the Sunni Muslims, the Egypt or Turkey. Lots of Sunni Muslims in Saudi Arabia, but it's sort of different because there is a particular group of Sunni Muslims there, interesting enough, that are Wahhabi Sunnis. They follow the teachings of a man known as Wahhab. Just as we had a Protestant Reformation, in about the 18th century, Islam had a Wahhabi or Muslim Reformation, which brought them back to a more rigorous and literal and fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. By the way, all the 9/11 hijackers were Wahhabi Sunnis, including Osama bin Laden. But those would be Sunnis, and by and large are a little different than the second group we're going to talk about, and those would be what? The Shiites. Now, they are known as the Shia, or the partisans. They actually believe that you have to have a leader on earth that has a link all the way back to Muhammad, in a sense, really back to Ali, his son-in-law. But here, again, these are individuals that are primarily found in southern Iraq and, most importantly, in Iran. In Iran, of course, they have imams, but probably the best known are what are known as ayatollahs. Those of you a little bit older, in the 1970s, you remember we had what? Ayatollah Khomeini, remember? And now we have an Ayatollah Khamenei, but probably the most significant individual in Iran right now is who? Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is the president. He's a particular kind of Shiite because he is a follower of the Mahdi, or what are called the Twelvers. He is believing that there is a Mahdi that is going to return back, the 12th Imam. He will return back, interestingly enough, in the midst of a confrontation, which I think Mahmoud Ahmadinejad believes is going to happen when Iran uses a nuclear weapon against what? The little Satan, who is what? Israel. He'd like to use it against the great Satan, which is who? The United States. So you again can see that what we're talking about is a much more virulent form of Islam, and they are found primarily in Iran, but also in southern Iraq. One third group I might mention real quickly, and those would be Sufis. The reason for that is that many of them are Persians. The Persians today are in Iran, but a lot of them also were in Iraq. They tend to be more the mystical type. As a matter of fact, they were the ones that gave us the stories of the flying carpets and the whirling dervishes. Saddam Hussein, who was the leader at one time in Iraq, actually used that to his advantage. If you today go to Babylon, they are rebuilding and have rebuilt the ancient city of Babylon. And if you look at the bricks, you will see that in the brick there's the picture of Nebuchadnezzar on one side and the picture of Saddam Hussein on the other side. He portrayed himself as the second Nebuchadnezzar. And really Paul kind of played into some of this mystical idea as well. So you can see that there are different kinds of Muslims as well, and that of course also explains that there are different kinds of ways in which they would interpret the scriptures. Well, let's, if we can, just give you a little bit of a background in how those two differ. And it explains perhaps why there has been so much tension in Iraq, trying to bring together a country that has Kurds in the north, Sunnis in the middle part and central part of Iraq, and Shiites in the southern part. Really, you have much diverse kinds of ideas. But again, Sunni about 80% of Muslims, Shiites about 20%. Sunnis elect Muhammad's successor. Shiites are looking for a successor who is tied to Allah. In the Sunnis, they have the traditions, the Sunnah and the Hadith. Certainly Shiites have that as well, but they also emphasize the authority of the Imam, the designated leader on earth, and having religious authority. Sunnis have at least sometimes a little bit of a separation between religious and civil authorities, but Shiites have really no separation between mosque and state. Very, very different kinds of ideas there as well. Let's, if we can, then come back to this idea of jihad. It is perhaps a big watershed issue that will help us understand whether or not we have peaceful Muslims in the world or whether we have aggressive Muslims in the world. Now, if you wanted to actually read a Quran, I'll give you the suggested assignment that if you just wanted to read the Quran and maybe just read one chapter, I would suggest that you read chapter 9. It would be Sunnah, the 9th chapter there, because in that particular section there, in the 9th surah, you would actually have lots of evidence here of this concept of jihad. Probably the best known verse is what is oftentimes referred to as the verse of the sword, and that's in Surah 9:5, which simply says, "Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem." I'm quoting from one of the most respected English translations of the Quran, but you could look at a number of different translations. Most of them are available online. You could read it without even buying the Quran, and you can check out and see that that is the case. Well, if you are a Muslim and you come to that verse and you believe that that is a principle that needs to be applied today, that's a fairly dangerous individual, right? Because it is telling you to go out there and seize them, beleaguer them, and to actually engage in a violent jihad. To give you just one more verse out of Surah 9, for example, Surah 9:29 says, "Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Prophet, nor acknowledge the religion of the truth, even if they are people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and find themselves subdued." Now, all sorts of words going on there, so let's sort them out. First of all, it talks about people of the book. Who are people of the book? Okay, it'd be Jews and Christians, primarily people of the book. And so that would certainly be the case. Here it says they pay the jizya, which is like a poll tax. And so in countries that have had Sharia law, they have had kind of an interesting three-part view. You have the Muslims, you had the infidels, but then you had some in the middle, the people of the book. They had to feel themselves subdued. That's oftentimes referred to as dimitude, and they had to pay a jizya. And so you can see that, again, this is this idea of those people that you fight against the infidels, but you also subdue the Christians and cause them to, in a sense, subdue themselves and bend their knee towards Islam. Now, oftentimes when people see this, they say, well, certainly there are quite a number of verses in the Qur'an that talk about war or jihad, but you know, there's also verses that talk about peace. Ever heard somebody say that Islam is really a religion of peace? You heard that before? Have you heard presidents say that before? You heard theologians say that before? Well, here's the best of it. Yes, there are verses that talk about peace, but here's the point. If you go back and look at those verses about peace, almost to a particular point, are in the verses that came from when Muhammad was a prophet in Mecca. They come from the Mecca surahs. But then when he was in power, he no longer talked about peace, he also talked about jihad. And in Islam, proper biblical, if you will, interpretation certainly requires applying one scripture to another scripture. And sometimes we recognize that in some ways later translations or revelations help us understand previous ones. Well, in Muslim interpretation, really later revelation can even contradict previous one. And so that particular idea is that those verses of the sword all come very late. So I wanted to suggest that you might want to read Surah 9. So a lot of people say, well, then we have lots and lots of verses about jihad, and those really are commanded. And I think illustrated by the fact that even this day you see fatwas into history all the time calling for some kind of war, some kind of jihad against the West. But here's another response that people have. Well, okay, maybe there are some verses of the sword in the Quran, but your Bible has some verses like that too. Ever heard that? Yeah. Let's think about that for just a minute. Because the point I would make is that as we go to 1 Samuel 15, I'll just pick one example here, we see that here Samuel, under the leading of the Lord, tells Saul to go out and to kill Amalek and the Amalekites. Okay, who are the Amalekites? Well, if you go back to the book of Exodus, you might actually run into the first terrorist we see in the Bible. Remember when the children of Israel were actually wandering in the wilderness? They were being attacked from behind by what? The Amalekites. Remember there was a battle, and during the battle, remember Moses, when he would raise his hand, what would happen? Well, the Israelites would prevail. But eventually, if I held my hand up here long enough, I just finally have to put it down, and then what happened then? Well, the Amalekites began to prevail, and so the battle was never fulfilled. And so here you now see that God is, through Samuel, calling Saul to go out and to kill them off. Now, I recognize that that's a particular passage that does call for that action. But interestingly enough, the next verse goes on and says, but then save the Kenites. They were in around that area which today we would call Petra in Jordan, and they are to be saved. So here, no collateral damage. A direct and specific command in the Old Testament theocracy towards a particular group of individuals. That's a little bit different than Surah 9:5 and Surah 9:29, isn't it? Which is universally binding command to go after all infidels and to kill them. Would you see the difference? Now, if you want to do a comparison between the New Testament and the Quran, it's even more striking, isn't it? Because in the New Testament, what are we supposed to do towards our enemies? Love our enemies. We're supposed to turn the other cheek. So here's the issue. The more literal a Christian takes the New Testament, the more likely they are to be what? Peace-loving. But the more literal a Muslim takes the Quran, the more likely they are to be what? Warlike and violent. One more verse just to illustrate the point. Here's Surah 47, verses 4 to 7. When you meet unbelievers, smite their necks. Then when you have made wide slaughter among them, tie fast the bonds, then set them free, either by grace or ransom, till the war lays down its loads. And those who are slain in the way of God, he will not send their works astray. He will guide them and dispose their minds aright, and he will admit them to where? Paradise, and that he has made known to them. And then they have certain benefits that they have in paradise, which again is one of the reasons why you have various martyrs, suicide bombers, and others, because really, if you think about it, the only true guarantee for salvation is to die in a holy jihad. We're going to get back to that in just a minute when we talk about witnessing to Muslims, but I think it illustrates only so well what indeed are some of the very important principles that oftentimes guide Islam around the world. Well, let's first look at the question of the Bible and the Qur'an. I've found that a very effective witnessing technique here in the United States, I might not use it in a Muslim country because you could get yourself in a lot of trouble, is to simply point out that the Bible and the Qur'an say different things. You know, it's what is called the law of non-contradiction. If A is true, the opposite of A can't be true in the same way at the same time. Does that make sense? And so, first of all, we can see that the Bible makes a number of claims, and what those claims are very different than the claims that the Qur'an makes. Now, what happens is Muslims will actually say that there is a difference, but not all, because sometimes they haven't studied it. So the first thing I find is very helpful if I'm talking with a Muslim is to simply say, you know, your Qur'an and my Bible say different things. Now, interestingly enough, there was a time in which Muhammad said some very positive things about what he called the before books. What were the before books? Well, those are the books written before the Qur'an. What would that be? The Old Testament and the New Testament. But then over time, some of his followers began to realize, wait a minute, the Qur'an makes some statements and the Bible makes some others. And they both can't be true. They both could be false, but they both cannot be true. So they began to come up with this idea that the Bible has been corrupted by Jews and Christians. So you have to understand some what I call basic apologetics. Does that make any sense? Not really when you think about it, because the Bible that Muhammad knew about in the 7th and 8th century essentially is the same Bible we have in the 1st century. And now we have manuscripts that are earlier and earlier and earlier, just showing that there is no corruption that has taken place. It's interesting, though, that one of the most popular movies in the Muslim world many years ago was the Da Vinci Code. What is the premise of the Da Vinci Code? That there's been corruption of the Bible. So again, you need to know how to answer those questions. But I think it is very important, and you can find on our website or even in my book all sorts of historical errors in the Qur'an. In other words, we have historical statements that the Bible makes, which we can validate. The Qur'an makes historical statements, and we can actually falsify those. Let's take just a few. The first and very obvious one is the Qur'an teaches that Jesus did not die on the cross. Okay, that's pretty different, isn't it, right off the bat? That an impostor died on the cross. That Jesus, though, is going to return once again, and he's going to destroy all pigs and all crosses. Eventually he's going to marry, have children, die, and be buried next to Muhammad. Okay, that's a really different view, both in the history of the New Testament as well as future eschatology. So there's one real quickly that is the case. Another one that's in the Qur'an is that the Samaritans tricked the Israelites at the Exodus. The problem with that is the Samaritans existed what? In the New Testament times, not in the Old Testament times. Or one more that I can mention, Alexander was a Muslim who actually worshipped Allah. You can go through, there's a very long list, but certainly one way is to talk about the fact that the Bible makes statements about history that have been validated by history and archaeology. The Qur'an makes statements about history that can be falsified. The second thing we can look at would be the issue of the nature and character of God. And I would suggest to you that this is the most effective witnessing technique that has been used over the years, because the views of God are very different. Now, have any of you ever heard people say that Christians and Muslims worship the same God? I've heard all sorts of presidents make that statement. Well, let's think about that for just a minute, because the Trinity is the first idea that is completely rejected in the Qur'an. The concept that God could have a partner is considered to be shirk or idolatry. And so right off the bat, there is a fundamental difference between a view of Trinity in the Bible and the belief in a monotheistic God by the name of Allah in the Qur'an. So there is a very obvious contradiction which we can talk about. But more than that, certainly we have to talk about the character of God as well, because Allah is totally transcendent. He is unknowable. He's capricious. He reveals himself through his holy prophet. He reveals himself through an angel. He reveals himself through the Quran, but he is not knowable. Is that the view that we have of the God of the Bible? Not at all. For example, can we as believers call God our Father? Sure. The Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. Now that is really something that would be foreign to an average Muslim believer. And this brings me now to a couple of research pieces that have been done by various seminaries. There was a seminary a number of years ago that looked at 700 former Muslims who had converted to Christianity. Now, since that time, it's bound up to about 800 former Muslims, but the first study was with 700 former Muslims that had converted to Christianity. They asked them, what was the number one reason you left Islam and became a Christian? You ready for this? The love of God. Which is why I say that when you talk to a Muslim, talk about the love of God. They cannot call God their Father. They cannot feel like they can have a personal relationship with God. So it has become one of the most effective witnessing tools is to talk about the love of God. It sounds strange to a Muslim. Sometimes they reject the concept. But this is one where sometimes you bypass the head and hit the heart. You know, if you've ever been around Ray Comfort or some of the others that have used the idea of evangelism that isn't always head-oriented but heart-oriented, this is a classic example of this because the love of God was the most profound and most significant reason why these hundreds of Muslims converted to Christianity. Let's look at some other issues as well here. We'll talk about, let's give it the next slide here. Here's a good example of just some of the differences between a view of God. Because lots of times people say, well, I think that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. But if you want to talk about the character, they're very, very different. Allah, Unitarian monotheism. Yahweh, Trinitarian monotheism. Allah, master-slave relationship. Whereas for us, a father-son, father-daughter relationship. Allah determines all. If you're around a Muslim, sometimes you hear this say, Shah Allah. What does that mean? As Allah wills. You know, I come into some money, Shah Allah. I fall down a flight of stairs, Shah Allah. God determines everything. And so in a sense, Allah is the author of both good and evil. Whereas we recognize that God is always good and allows a free choice on our part. Let's look at a couple of other aspects as well. One is the person and work of Jesus. For example, we can see right here that the Quran, as I just mentioned a minute ago, denies that he is the Son of God. And they obviously deny the resurrection of Jesus. So as a result, you have a very different view of who Jesus Christ is. So again, just as we heard from Greg Kokel, really helping people understand who Jesus is absolutely key, because again, they have a very different view of who Jesus is. And then we can also look at one other issue, and that is the issue of sin and salvation. For the typical Muslim, they really deny the fall. They believe that Adam and Eve fell, but God forgave them, so they really don't believe in this idea of original sin. And so as a result, they really, in a sense, deny sin nature, and because of that, believe that ultimately they can work their way to heaven. That salvation comes through submission to the will of Allah through the 5 pillars of Islam. And this now brings us to a second very powerful witnessing tool. That is, remember when we talked about those 700 former Muslims that had converted to Christianity? What was the number one reason why they converted? The love of God. What was the number 2 reason? Assurance of salvation. Because a Muslim lives in a world where he or she does not know if they'll be saved. There is this image in the Quran of this fulcrum that my good works will outweigh my bad works, and maybe it is possible that this unknowable Allah will allow me into paradise, but I will never know for sure. But here, again, is the power of the gospel, because we can share with them that they indeed can know that they are saved even at that point. And again, that is the second very powerful technique to share about the eternal salvation that we can have, the eternal life we can have by trusting in Jesus Christ. Let me summarize real quickly before we move on real briefly to the issue of terrorism. The fundamental issue, if we are talking to Muslims, is salvation. Certainly the Bible states that it is impossible to be accepted by God on the basis of works. If you came here today and you've never accepted Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord, I bear you very bad news, because there is nothing that you can do to merit favor before a holy and righteous God. But the good news we see in Ephesians 2:8 and 9 is simply that only by God's grace can we be saved. Ephesians 2:8 and 9 tells us that we are saved by what? Grace. Not by what? Works. And so again, we can see that really one of the most important verses oftentimes for a Muslim is to look at Ephesians 2:8 and 9, or to be looking at the gospel. And you know, I mentioned a minute ago that Muhammad gave Muslims permission to read what are called the before books. And so oftentimes what missionaries in other countries have done is they will say, you know, your Qur'an says that you can actually read these before books. And these before books tell about this man by the name of Jesus. And your Qur'an says that he was a prophet, he was the Messiah, he was sinless. Would you like to know about this sinless prophet? You can read about this because Muhammad allowed you to read the before books. Here's the Gospel of John. It's a very powerful way to begin to get them into the gospel. Because only if Jesus is divine can he provide a sacrifice sufficient for the sins of the world. Well, in the few minutes we have left, let me talk briefly about the other aspect of that. Because in the interest of time, we'll just move on from there to talk about this issue of radical Islam. Because we live in a world where not only are there some Muslims that are peace-loving, but there are other Muslims that are certainly those who are dedicated to jihad. How do we think through this? Well, first of all, let's talk about what has happened in the Middle East. And the primary individual until recently was Osama bin Laden, but he has many followers that are still here even though he is no longer alive. He issued a fatwa years ago saying to kill Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible. So a lot of people say this is not just a typical war where combatants fight one another. It's a war, interestingly enough, where also we can use these kinds of techniques and these kind of terror actions against civilians. He also called on a fatwa to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to remove their armies from the land of Islam. Where is the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Jerusalem. And I think it illustrates again that we have a battle taking place right now in Israel. This Sunday, I'm going to be at Living Hope Bible Church. In the first hour, I'm going to be speaking on the Middle East today. We're going to talk about Libya and Syria and Egypt and all that. In the second hour, Middle East prophecy. And I'll go into that in more detail. But it is amazing how, even just talking about the Middle East, how many times I use the word Muslim or Islam, because that's where the battle is taking place. And a lot of people have said, what is it about Jerusalem that is so significant? And I think for the Jews, it's pretty obvious. I mean, Abraham took Isaac there. We have, of course, the Ark of the Covenant. Solomon built his first temple. And even Christians believe that the Messiah will someday rule there and establish a place of worship. But what about the Muslims? Because there's no evidence that Muhammad even made it to Jerusalem. Well, it goes back to Surah 17, in which this is a story that is told by Muhammad of a night journey. And before he goes into heaven, his steed touches this rock and then he ascends into heaven. And after the Muslim armies took over Jerusalem, they argued that that rock, where that steed's foot touched, is the dome of the rock. And so as a result, now you have this idea of the dome of the rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so you have this Temple Mount right now, which is perhaps the most contested piece of real estate in the world. And I think illustrates again why, even though Israel is a very small country and Jerusalem is just one city, the nations of the world still look at what is happening there in the Middle East. More than that, though, we not only are dealing with radical Islam in the Middle East, we're also dealing with radical Islam here in this country as well. And that has to do with the fact that each day, during the height of the immigration that was going across, illegal immigration going across our border, about 4,000 illegal immigrants entered the United States. That has dropped out, but somebody pointed out that that's sort of like 10 jumbo jets landing in all sorts of different places simultaneously. Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and Denver and Houston and New York and Atlanta, and people getting off those planes and nobody knew where they came from or why they came to this country. And the biggest concern is that obviously we know that some people are coming here illegally because they want to find a job and to enjoy the benefits of American society. But as a person that's lived in Texas for many years, I also know that we have a significant number of those that are called OTMs, which stands for what? Other than Mexican. And I've looked at some of those backpacks, and you open up some of those there. One in particular had the blueprints for a nuclear power reactor. Now, you could believe that they just simply wanted to work there, but I think maybe they had something else in mind. And so again, some people have become very concerned about our borders. Not just our borders there, but also even border security. Each day, 16,000 different ships enter our ports, and very few of those containers are inspected, and a lot of people have wondered about some of the things that are happening from outside this country and what those who might intend harm might want to use our freedom against us. But more than that, there are about 1,400 different mosques that have been built in the United States. Almost all of those have been built from funds from the Wahhabi Sunnis, which I mentioned just a minute ago, in Saudi Arabia. Many of the 9/11 hijackers received support from them. And more importantly, we have begun to identify what many people call an Islamic terrorist network. I live in the Dallas area, and recently we prosecuted one of those particular dots on that screen there, where the money had been used theoretically to help Muslims, but it was actually used to fund terrorist organizations. Those individuals were caught and put into jail, but it reminds us again that if you aren't praying for those in authority, your president, your 2 senators, your congressmen, people that work in the Defense Department and Homeland Security, you certainly need to pray for them as well. And the need for us to begin to think biblically about how we can begin to make us safe, at the same time recognize that we don't want to paint with a real broad brush and say that all Muslims are radical, but those that are dangerous. By the way, a book I might recommend is come out the last couple of years, In the Name of God, Understanding the Mindset of Terrorism, written by 2 individuals in the military, certainly going through many of these key verses that talk about how we think about these areas from a biblical point of view. But finally, wanted to mention the fact that if you wanted some more information on this, first of all, we do have a number of these books out there on the table. I have a biblical point of view series. We have more than just those, with the biblical point of view on Islam, biblical point of view on homosexuality, biblical point of view on intelligent design, biblical point of view on spiritual warfare. These are books that I have written in which I try to identify the 50 or 60 most asked questions that show up in my radio program, and then I try to give good answers that I have, as well as quotes from some of the best and the brightest people I've ever been able to bring on my radio program Point of View. So again, fairly easy to read, fairly simple to read, and those are out there on the table in case any of you are interested. But finally, let me also send you to our website. I'm with a group called Probe Ministries, and our website is probe.org. And if you haven't written anything down tonight, you might want to write that down, probe.org, for this reason. Every one of the 3-minute radio programs we do, we have transcripts for, and the transcripts for every one of those radio programs is there, as well as other articles that we have written, as well as email answers where people will ask questions, we'll give an email answer. And then we put out the Probe Alert. The latest Probe Alert is on Hunger Games, but it's on all sorts of different things and different movies and different articles and research and everything. Each one of the staff members has a master's or a PhD, science, government, philosophy, history, religion, education, on and on and on, in which we address various issues. Every one of those articles on the Probe website is free of charge. You are free to download those. You are free to make multiple copies and use them in your ministry. Is that good news? Also, we have podcasts there. You're free to download every one of those podcasts and use them in that way. We also have 50 different PowerPoint presentations. If you said, okay, I want to steal you blind. I like this presentation on Islam. I want to give it to my Sunday school class. If you had a computer, you could just open it up right now and download one of those. Or I think we have about 3 or 4 different presentations on Islam, and you're free to use those. And again, those are all free of charge. You like the price? Pretty good. Except for the books and the DVDs, which we charge you because they charge us. Everything else is free, so feel free to use that. And if you have a ministry to people with other languages, for example, I counted the other day about 135 different articles in Spanish, where we hired a Spanish translator. We have them in other languages as well. It's all available at the Pro website. So I hope that you will go there. Hope that you will find that helpful. And I want to say thank you for staying all this time and showing attention on a Friday night. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. We'll see you then.